Welcome back, everybody. Hope everybody that attended the National had a wonderful time. It was really cool watching some of the videos and hearing some of the stories of people that attended. I myself did not attend it this year. I'll definitely be in attendance next year. I wanted to put together a video this weekend, but I want to do something a little bit different than what I normally do, which probably would be reviewing a set, doing a mail day, or talking about a modern White Sox player, or even vintage cards from like the 1950s onwards. We're going to go back in time, and this is T-206 time. I'm certainly not the guy to go to if you're wanting to learn the most about T-206s. There's a lot of resources online, and there's going to be tons of stuff on YouTube, people who are actually T-206 collectors. There are over 500 different cards, or 500 cards in the set, and beyond that when you consider how many different backs they have on there. So that's not really something I'm going to kind of talk about too much. And I only have one T-206 in my collection, which is right there in front of you. I'm going to talk about that guy and the card in itself in a minute. I had one other one when I was younger. Ended up selling it. It was actually a graded copy of Fred Clark, and I wish I would have held on to it now in hindsight, because it was a Hall of Fame T-206 card, and I think looking at now to be able to replace that card in a similar grade is so much more expensive than it was when I sold it back in the day. But I do have one other card in my collection that I did hold on to, and I picked this one up for a very specific reason. At the time I was buying this card, it actually was reading some books about early baseball from the late 1890s through the early 1910s and 1920s. Stuff I really didn't know a lot about at that point, but obviously I've learned a lot more about it since that time. And one name that came up quite a bit as that was kind of intriguing to me was the card you see right in front of me, and this is Hal Chase. I'm going to first go over the card a little bit and then talk about Hal Chase himself. So this is one of the T-206s. He's got two different cards in the set. One is actually in a fielding, or I think fielding pose, if I'm not mistaken. And then he's got the portrait. The portrait's got a couple different variations. There's a pink background on one of them, and that's actually much more expensive and more rare. I believe this is actually about the most common type you can get on here. So this also has this capital cigarettes backing. I think there's 16 different is what I saw when I was just doing a little look-see on the set. I believe there's 16 different types of backs you can get on these cards. I'm not sure how many different backs there are for specifically this card. This one's in decent conditioning. It's got creasing all over the place on it, and that would probably be its biggest detractor on it. I think I picked it up for like maybe $10 back 20 years ago or something like that off of eBay, and now it's probably a card that's going to be worth much more than that. Probably the thing that takes away from the most is his eyeball. It's got the center point of a crease right in there, so you can't really see his eyeball on there. But this is Hal Chase in his New York Highlander jersey, who later became the New York Yankees. So Hal Chase he's got two lives in baseball. One, probably a guy that was a borderline Hall of Famer. And second, a guy that is also on the list with Pete Rose and Fearless Joe Jackson and the rest of the White Sox, the Black Sox, for being banned from baseball by Kennesaw Mountain Landis. So his story is not uncommon to some of the early baseball players that got put on the list, and this is for gambling. So Hal Chase entered into the league in 1905 and played for the Highlanders. He held out for a little while after his 1905 season, I think, to be able to make more money. He eventually did get a higher contract, but I think he had to pay a slight fine because he had to come back late. He reported late to training as a result of it. Played for the Highlanders through part of from 1905 all the way into 1912, which is about the time that he got moved over to the Chicago White Sox for a couple of years. During that time, he was often regarded as maybe the best fielding first baseman of his era. I know it's not something that's really, going to catch a lot of eyes when you're kind of thinking about guys that should be in the Hall of Fame, but fielding at that time was not easy. They didn't have very manicured fields. The balls were not often in great shape, and so the balls would be very hard to be able to kind of field on those grounds. And he played first base, obviously the position that is going to touch the ball not as much as the catcher and the pitcher, but probably the most on the field outside of that. So he was regarded for being a highly sought after and well astute first baseman because of his fielding. During that time frame, he started to build a reputation, though. A lot of the early baseball players didn't make a lot of money, so what they would do often on the side was be able to try and gamble on the games they were playing in. And this is not too dissimilar than maybe playing a pickup game with your friends and kind of saying, okay, we're going to bet a six-pack on this or bet $100 on who's going to win. So it was kind of friendly gambling probably initially, but he was also doing side bets with gamblers, like many of the players at his time as well. In fact, when he was kind of quoted about his early experiences in baseball with gambling, he would often say that some players had it in deep with some of the gamblers pretty much for their entirety of their salary for the season, which is kind of like crazy to see how kind of bad it went. But these are guys that were highly competitive and had often, sometimes many of them struggled with forms of addiction as well and got caught up like any person could in those situations. Hal Chase was one that typically was trying to come out ahead. So he moved from kind of doing side bets to actually trying to fix games. So he was then kind of known from time to time to be able to kind of throw a game, to be able to win money, or to kind of negotiate throwing a game with other players on his team or the opposing team to be able to make money off the game themselves. So he started to really build that reputation as a guy you could go to if you wanted to make a little bit of money on the side. During that time, he was often chasing a buck too. He was one of the players that went on and joined the Federal League back in 1913 and 14 because they obviously were sort of a renegade league that was challenging the American League and the National League. Was paying higher salaries for these players, so he was jumped out of his contract at that time with the White Sox and went over to play for Buffalo. And one of those seasons, he actually led the league in home runs, which is something he had never done before. After that, he was able to be reabsorbed into Major League Baseball, like the rest of the players who were forgiven during that time frame of actually jumping their contracts and going to the Federal League after it dissolved. And he actually had a batting title. He won a batting title with the Cincinnati Reds in 1916. He batted .339 that year and led the league also in hits as well. So he continued to play for a few more years, played for Cincinnati through 1918, and then went over to the New York Giants in 1919. And that's where his kind of career kind of ended. Part of the reason he was moved on from Cincinnati because Christy Mathewson was working in their front office at that time and didn't really feel that Hal Chase had a great reputation, and also felt that he may have been responsible for being a bad influence around his other teammates for possibly throwing games. This was right before the 1919 White Sox scandal, and I think gambling was coming to really its high point within the game. Players kind of doing side bets and throwing games at times, and it was really just very hard to regulate because sometimes the umpires were even involved in these things. So anyway, kind of going advance to 1919, part of the reason that the Black Sox started beginning investigated is because he was connected to Sleepy Bill Burns, who was one of the guys allegedly who's involved with setting up the White Sox, the 8 players for the White Sox for throwing the World Series. And that allegedly he made a nice little payday off of this because he knew the White Sox were going to throw the World Series. So anyway, I'm not sure how much that really came out of anything, if it really amounted much to anything. But for a time, he was a part of the investigation with that to see kind of what he knew, if he was involved, maybe setting up the World Series to be thrown. So he was out of American League and National League Baseball at that time. He was playing in the Pacific Coast League when it was being investigated in 1920. And during that time frame, you would think somebody who's going to be being a little bit investigated because his connection with the Black Sox might actually be on good behavior, but he was still throwing games. This time he was a coach with the Pacific Coast League teams, and he was arranging teams to be able to throw games. And paying off umpires and things like that. So the corruption kind of continued with Hal Chase at that point. Eventually, as you know, the players who later were found not guilty were later suspended for life because the Kennesaw Mountain Landis believed that he didn't want any players' names that were connected with gambling and throwing a game, having knowledge of throwing a game, ever to be part of Major League Baseball going forward. Now, we know that in hindsight, there were some names that they probably had a good case on that they didn't pursue to their fullest because of their worry about the reputation of baseball because of how big those names were after this happened. But for the at least for this time, he was one of the players that actually got suspended. I know a lot of the publicity and the history goes with the 8 guys, the White Sox, that got suspended, but there were other players that got thrown out of it for gambling about the same time too. And Hal Chase was probably the biggest name of that other group. So again, Hal Chase, for his career, his WAR is 23, so not really a Hall of Fame kind of number, but they did get some support for the Hall of Fame when they were doing early voting, but never obviously amounted to the numbers of 75 and above to be able to make it into the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. And I think at that time they didn't maybe like look at it the same way they did with like Pete Rose, who couldn't even get on the ballot. Hal Chase was on the early ballot, probably because they just hadn't even established it at the Hall of Fame at the time he actually got done playing. Hal Chase kind of bounced around thereafter and worked a variety of different jobs later on to his death, which I believe was, if I'm not mistaken, look it up real quick here, he died in 1947. His nickname when he played was Prince Hal, because of the way he kind of looked and played on the field. A lot of people kind of thought of him pretty fondly. I think players, for the most part, kind of liked him for the most part during his era. But like I said, he did kind of build that reputation as somebody that was known to be willing to take a bet on a game, and was later on known potentially to, or suspected to be, someone you could go to actually throw a game. So I wanted to do just a little bit on that card because it's not really a guy I hear talked about too much in the game's history, even though there's lots to read about him. But it's actually a guy that held kind of a certain place in baseball history as it relates to guys and gambling during the early part of the last century. And a name I didn't want to necessarily kind of have people kind of forget, if you will. So I wanted to be able to kind of capture him on the channel tonight. So that's my one T-206 card. I hope you guys kind of enjoyed it. There's a lot of resources out there if you want to be able to read more about Hal Chase, and I encourage you to be able to do so if you're interested in learning more about his career. Have a great night. I'll probably have a mail day later this week at some point. Maybe a brief video next weekend, and then I think the following week I may not have too much to capture or film that week, but I may have some videos from my trip that I'm going to be taking that I might be able to share when I get back. All right, so I hope everybody has a wonderful night.